Good morning, good afternoon, and good day. A very warm welcome to the Global Chamber of Commerce. Here in London today, we're going to be hosting our Cultural and Communication Workshop with Victoria Rennoldson. But before we get started, my name is Katie Keith and I'm the Executive Director for the Global Chamber here in London. And just to give you a little bit about who we are, we focus on international trade and investment, opening doors for businesses in 190 countries and 525 metros around the world. If you're looking at expanding your operations into new markets or looking at servicing clients to make that expansion easy, we're here to help open those doors. Today is a unique Globinar designed to help you, to educate you on becoming a global communicator. So I'm really excited to be handing over to Victoria today to take us through our workshop and then take us through what next and how we can expand our knowledge even further. So Victoria, without further ado, I'd like to hand over you to take the lead.
Thank you so much, Katie, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining me here today. It's always such a pleasure to be featured and invited to speak at the Global Chamber, and it's brilliant to see so many of you joining from all over the world. So a very good morning and good afternoon, and perhaps even good evening to some of you as well. We're going to get stuck in, and this is a really an interactive session. I'm going to be asking you some questions as we go along. So please do not be shy. Feel free. We're not a very, very large group here today, so we can have some really good discussions. And at various points, I'll ask you questions. Feel free to unmute and join in. If you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat and I'll check in regularly to see if you have any questions I can answer. So let's get started. Let me get this up on screen. So we are talking about CQ, Cultural Intelligence to Grow Globally. I'm sure that many of you have heard of IQ and EQ, emotional intelligence, but CQ is the next Q, cultural intelligence, and we'll be talking about why that is so important. I felt this was a particularly relevant topic to be talking about at Global Chamber. As you can see, the Global Chamber motto is Be Global and Unstoppable, and I think CQ very much fits in with that. Now, some of you I know already, some of you I don't know. I'm going to introduce myself more formally in a minute. But before I do, one of the starting points that I want to go to is what is even this idea of culture that we're talking about? So I'm going to ask you to get your thinking hats on, because I think it's really interesting when we ask this very simple question, what do we actually even mean when we say culture? So start your thinking now. But in the meantime, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Victoria Rennoldson. I'm based here in London, the UK. And I am a communication and cultural intelligence coach and trainer. And I work with global leaders and teams all over the world, particularly focusing on topics to do with cross-cultural training, global team communication, and communication confidence, especially for those who are operating in English as a second language. I launched a podcast at the end of last year, Cultural Communication Confidence, and I'm really pleased to say that is doing exceptionally well. So if that today is a really interesting topic for you, please feel free to follow me on all the usual podcast platforms, and you'll be able to get my weekly episodes on all things communication and culture. It's also worth saying that Culture Cuppa, my company, I founded 8 years ago. In fact, we just celebrated my business birthday. And this is actually my second career. My first career was in international brand marketing. And I had a lot of experiences where I was working in global teams, in lots of virtual calls, meeting people, experiencing working with many different people from around the world. And I experienced firsthand some of the joys, opportunities of working globally in a large corporate environment, and also experiencing occasionally those frustrations, those issues when things were not going smoothly, those miscommunications. Maybe we can mute. Thank you so much. There's miscommunications when things didn't always go according to plan. And it's from this time that I really had the gem of the idea. Actually, there is something in where communication meets culture, where I can really help and support people, whether they are working in corporate environments or growing their own businesses and expanding their businesses globally. So let's come back to this question I asked just earlier, this question of what is culture? I am going to invite you now to unmute and let me know, when I say this word, what are you thinking about?
A way of being.
A way of being. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie, for kicking us off. Anybody else?
I think of it as almost an inherent framework that shapes how we behave and interact in our kind of way of existing in the world.
That's great, Courtney. I love that. You talked about behaviors there. You talked about interaction. That's really important. It's always about relativity to others. Thank you. Lovely. Any other suggestions, contributions?
Thinking we belong to a number of different systems, and each of those systems has a number of different cultural values. So could be family, could be origins of birth, it could be company values, quite a lot.
Absolutely. And I'm so pleased you brought that up, Fabronia. Here today, we are specifically talking about the global context and primarily thinking about national culture, but we're quite complex beings. We have multiple cultural influences on us, and that could be about our gender, it could be about our religion, it could be about our ethnicity, it could be about the sector we work in and the company culture we're part of. So there are many different influences on us. Lovely. Anybody else who wants to contribute? What is culture? Well, I think, we've had a number of suggestions there, and I really love the way that you're already thinking about this idea of culture. And clearly, there is no right or wrong here. There are many different ways and different lenses for us to think about this idea of culture. To help with this idea, I would want to share with you now a short clip from a video from Sheena Yanga, who is going to share a story which I think is really interesting and talks a little bit about how culture works and what happens when we experience cultures which are maybe a little bit different from our own. So I'm going to share this now. It's only about a minute long. I'm going to check as well that you can hear it as well. So I'm just going to go to here. Okay, so.
Today I'm going to take you around the world in 18 minutes. My base of operations is in the US, but let's start at the other end of the map, in Kyoto, Japan, where I was living with a Japanese family while I was doing part of my dissertational research 15 years ago. I knew even then that I would encounter cultural differences and misunderstandings, but they popped up when I least expected it. On my first day, I went to a restaurant and I ordered a cup of green tea with sugar. After a pause, the waiter said, "One does not put sugar in green tea." "I know," I said, "I'm aware of this custom, but I really like my tea sweet." In response, he gave me an even more courteous version of the same explanation. "One does not put sugar in green tea." "I understand," I said, "that the Japanese do not put sugar in their green tea, but I'd like to put some sugar in my green tea." Surprised by my insistence, the waiter took up the issue with the manager. Pretty soon, a lengthy discussion ensued, and finally the manager came over to me and said, "I am very sorry, we do not have sugar." Well, since I couldn't have my tea the way I wanted it, I ordered a cup of coffee, which the waiter brought over promptly. Resting on the saucer were 2 packets of sugar.
Okay, so I'm going to pause that there and let's come back together and have a bit of a chat. So Sheena was explaining her story when, as an American, she went across to Japan. And I'm quite intrigued to kind of understand from you now, what did you think was going on there? What might explain some of these cultural differences that Sheena encounters? Feel free to unmute. Let me know what you think about what was happening in that video.
Well, I find it quite funny because I lived in Italy for a while, and it was very similar interactions where, I would say, can I have some milk in the sciacquarato? And they would say, no, you can't do that. And I would say, really, you can. But it's a cultural thing that I felt they partly were trying to help me enjoy the best sciacquarato possible. But equally, it's offensive to them that you're not doing it the way that they think is the best way to have that dish or drink. This sounds a little similar to that.
Absolutely. That's a great example, Courtney. Thank you so much for sharing that story. So there's something in the dynamic between what an individual wants as a customer and what they expect as a customer, and also what the purpose of service maybe looks like in a restaurant or a cafe in different cultures. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Any other thoughts about what was going on, particularly in that video?
I thought it was interesting. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry, you go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
I was just going to build on the Italian example because I'm of Italian origin, and my grandma used to say to me, you can't drink cappuccino after a certain time in the day because the cappuccino is just for the morning. You don't have milky coffees after lunch, as an example. So I think there's kind of trying to incorporate you into their culture and kind of welcoming you in, but we can be a little bit humiliated and embarrassed by it.
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic there about the position of power, what we're being told. Thank you for sharing that, Fabronia. I love that story as well. And Richard, you had something you wanted to comment on here.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's like you said about the service. I mean, it's especially in the United States where I've seen it the most, where it's like, I know people don't do this, but I like this, but I want this. And I've noticed that when I'll go to a dinner with work colleagues at like a gala where everyone is served the same food. Some people like the chicken but take off the breading. Some people eat the breading but not the chicken. Some people eat the lettuce and the salad but not the tomatoes and stuff. And so you see little piles of food around that it isn't eaten on the Americans' plates. And I've never seen that anywhere else besides in the United States, where like all the food is kind of like separated into what I like and what I don't like, and no one makes a fuss out of it. So there's an American thing of I like this the way that, yes, you can, if it's possible, then I should be able to have it, because that's the way that I like things. So like you said about service and what service should mean.
Indeed. Richard, that's a really great example as well. And if I was going to offer some terminology at this point, we could talk about the cultural value of being individualist, being collectivist. In the US and to a certain extent in the UK, we're quite individualist. We're quite focused on what we want as individuals, what we want to achieve, our autonomy in the way that we operate. Somewhere like Japan, for example, is a very collectivist culture where actually it's much more about harmony, people discussing and agreeing what is the best way forward together. And that includes things like the rules and the etiquette of doing things. Now, we're just talking about tea here, or food, or cappuccino, and that's just food and drink, something very, very everyday. Can you imagine when we talk about global business and growing our business globally, how complicated it can start getting when we build in things like negotiations, meetings, interview situations, and what we might need to take into account, which is similar and different between our own and others' cultural values. In fact, a great way of talking about culture is thinking about what is accepted and familiar. You can see some images on the screen here, and these are about everyday life. So how we learn, how we socialize, how we commute, how we interact with our religions. And the idea of culture is effectively how things are done. They're often the unspoken rules. Often people can't even explain their own cultures because they've never really thought about it because they've grown up within the culture. So this idea of accepted and familiar is great when you know it yourself. But what happens if you don't know what is accepted and familiar in other cultures? There's a great question which comes at this point, which is really, what happens when we do want to expand globally, and how can we really make sure that we succeed? The Cultural Intelligence Centre, which is an organisation that I'm certified with and I'm associate trainer with, put this question 20 years ago and have been researching it ever since. They've been asking the question, what is the difference between individuals and organisations that succeed and those that fail? We sort of assume that the world is a small place. We're in a globalised environment. We can all connect to the touch of a button. So surely it all should be quite easy. But in reality, we know that lots of organizations and companies fail when they try to expand internationally. And we also know people who are incredibly experienced and great leaders, but when they move to a new location, working in very different environments, they find it challenging. So how do we actually define this? Well, through this research, the Cultural Intelligence Centre have defined this idea of cultural intelligence as something that we can measure and define and understand what makes the difference between success and failure. So cultural intelligence is a capability to function and relate effectively in culturally diverse situations. What's important about this is it's a capability. You can actually measure it. It's not just awareness and knowing facts and figures. It is something that you can develop and actually see how you are progressing over time. It's also not just about how you're operating. I think somebody earlier on talked about interactions, and that's really, really important because it's also about how we make connections and build relationships with people. And then finally, culturally diverse situations. It doesn't matter where you are around the world, even if you are just working in one location, you are still going to be working probably in a very diverse situation. That is our reality day to day. And this is incredibly important as we move forward, whether we're working across borders or we're working in culturally diverse contexts in one location. Now, I'm sure the fact that you're here today says that you can clearly see the benefits of cultural intelligence. You can see this on screen now. Point is, when we have cultural intelligence, we can actually really predict and understand how we might be more successful when working with different markets. We can understand our customers and our partners better. We can also understand our internal teams. I often support global virtual teams who are working together in many different locations who never meet each other. And they really need to understand each other to be able to communicate, to really understand what's going on and take the actions that are going to make the difference for project delivery. And ultimately, this point about it actually brings the sales, the profitability and the cost savings. I believe CQ is critically important to the success. It's also a business priority for if you're working in a corporate environment. According to the Economist Intelligence Unit, 90% of leading executives from 68 countries said finding effective cross-cultural personnel is a top management challenge. I think that's incredibly compelling research. And when I shared this yesterday, when I was talking at London Business School, they were really very wowed by this particular statistic. What exactly is this cultural intelligence that we're talking about? Well, we're going to explore this through a couple of myths that often come up when we talk about the idea of building businesses, building our careers globally. Now, these are the myths, but we're actually going to do this in a fun way. Hopefully there is a poll, which Katie, if you could kindly bring up on screen now. And what I would love for you to do is you'll see 3 key questions on screen. And all you have to do is to say whether you think it's true or false. So read the statements and vote on those 3 questions. And then we'll discuss afterwards why we voted true or false. So feel free to cast your votes now. Katie, because I can't actually see the poll, perhaps when the majority have voted, you could share the
Halfway
results
there.
on screen. Thank
Yes.
you.
We're halfway there. So about 54% have participated so far. So, and
Lovely,
I can see people changing their mind, and then it.
Go with your gut instinct is what I'd say.
So we're up to 68%. And I'll just remind everybody to stay muted, if you could.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're up to 68%, but we haven't had any movement. I might just give it another 72%.
Oh, well, why don't you, when you're ready, if you're able to share the results on the screen, we'd love to share with everybody. Are you able to do that?
There we go.
Thank you so much, Katie. Brilliant. So let's have a look at these results together. And what we can see is, oh, this is really interesting. We do have some split opinions. Okay, so let's take these one by one. The first one, the more international travel, the higher the CQ, the higher the cultural intelligence. Who voted true for this and would like to unmute and explain why they chose this? Anybody feeling they want to share?
I can share.
Thank you. Eileen.
I voted true because I think that when you travel, you get to know more culture, and then you open to these cultures, and therefore you're more open to the world.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. That makes a lot of sense. And is there anybody here who voted false who would love to share why they chose false?
I would love to.
Right. Yes, Catherine, go for it.
I chose false simply because over the past 25 years, I've seen so many people who were traveling a lot for business, and whilst a great number of them are very open people who then took that opportunity to learn more, like Celine mentioned before, there were also quite a high percentage who just had their own idea about how things should be done, and they often saw the ways that a foreign culture would deal with certain problems. For example, things like deadlines, hierarchy, controversial topics, all of those kind of classical cultural topics. If they didn't act according to the British or according to the German model that they would expect to see, that was then wrong, and it was a clear indication that that culture was, lazy or incompetent, or it was taken as a judgment of the people rather than as a signal that there was perhaps a cultural question that needed to be looked at.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Catherine. And I think that's really important, that so this idea of international travel, it can mean absolutely we are open and curious about the world. And yet that example was really interesting that Catherine shared. And equally, I know there are business travelers who spend a lot of time traveling around the world, but only ever see an airplane, an airport, the office, and a hotel, and they have no cultural exposure. And so that is a really interesting question, that it doesn't necessarily mean, there isn't a direct correlation. It can mean that, but not necessarily. Febroni, did you want to say something on that?
Yes, no, I just wanted to add that it also depends in what capacity you travel. In my career, I've traveled sometimes as a global representative on strategy, and other times I've traveled as a local representative. And so sometimes you can have your own agenda. So if you're trying to get the local market on board with a global agenda, you may not be as open to their cultural needs as would be helpful. So I think it also depends what capacity you're flying around the world in.
Absolutely, that's a really good observation. Thank you for sharing that. Now, the second question, the higher the technical competence, the higher CQ. I do see there is a little bit of a split, but I can see that the vast majority have gone with false. And in this circumstance, again, it can be true that you have high technical competence and high CQ, but there isn't a direct correlation. It isn't this means this. So I would go with false here. And then the last one, this is more equally split again. So I'm going to talk about this one. The higher the EQ, emotional intelligence, the higher the CQ. Would somebody like to unmute and say why they said true? Would anybody like to share? Or if not, would anybody like to unmute and say why they chose false?
I can talk about false. I was actually torn on this one and the other one because I'm guessing that of people with higher EQ in general, overall, CQ would probably be higher, but on an individual basis, one doesn't necessarily depend on the other. So that I was kind of torn on the first question as well. But so the reason why I said false is because one can have high emotional intelligence without high CQ. So it's definitely the case that that they do function independently, not 100% independently, but I'm also kind of wondering because I know there's a lot of data around CQ, and I'm just wondering when you look at larger groups of people, how international travel and EQ correlate on larger data sets.
Understand, Richard. Thank you for putting into perspective and the dilemma that you had when you thought about this one. Now, this one's a really fascinating one. And the first thing I need to say is that clearly EQ is incredibly important. We all need improved EQ. However, how we express EQ is going to vary from culture to culture. So if we think about a couple of cultures that have been mentioned today, think about how EQ would be expressed perhaps in somewhere like Italy, and think about how EQ might be expressed in somewhere like Japan. They would have very different points of view about how to demonstrate things like connection, warmth, friendliness, even how to express things like professionalism. And therefore, this idea of the connection between EQ and CQ, it can be true, but it isn't a direct correlation because the way we express our emotions and the EQ can vary from culture to culture. So this is the important point here. Right, so if I could ask, I think I can close it, but if we can close the poll now, thank you so much for taking part in that poll. I hope you found that very fascinating. Start exploring this idea of what do we actually really mean by CQ and how does it fit in with other areas of expertise and competence. I'm now going to take you into a bit more detail around how do we think about CQ. So this is the CQ framework, which specifically comes from Cultural Intelligence Center. There are other approaches and frameworks out there, and I particularly want to share this one because I believe quite passionately that this really makes a very big difference when we think about this differentiation between success and failure when working globally. The approach in some ways is very, very simple, but actually there is a lot of detail and context behind each of these. And I'm going to just give you a real top line flavor of this today. It starts in the top left with CQ Drive. This is all about your level of interest, persistence, and confidence during multicultural interactions. Now, I could suspect that most of you here are really interested in multicultural interactions. That's why you're here. You're here to learn. You're also, some of you, Global Chamber members. So you absolutely are interested in that. Having the resilience and to persist and be confident no matter what comes up, that's a bit more tricky. We then have CQ knowledge. Now, this is traditionally where cultural awareness training used to sit, where you would learn everything there is to learn about the British, the French, the Brazilians, the Spanish. However, there's a fundamental problem with that, which is, of course, that we're not all just one big lump of people. We are all very interesting and different, and we have lots of different cultural influences. So you can absolutely get insights and start to get some knowledge about what might be different when you're meeting people. But you can't take that in isolation. You have to see the person you're meeting, the people who are in front of you. And knowledge by itself is just insight. What you have to do is actually apply that knowledge. That's where CQ strategy comes in, which is your awareness and ability to plan for multicultural interactions. And obviously a plan is great, but then you need to turn that into action. This is where the magic happens, where you know which elements of your communication to adapt, what elements of what you're saying, your messaging, how you say it. We're now going to go into each of these in a bit more detail, but before we do, I'd like to ask you a question. Where do you believe you are today? Usually we do assessments and we can measure these and give feedback, but if you hear these 4 different areas, you might start to get a feel already for which ones are your stronger areas and perhaps which of those areas you might need to work on and develop yourself. If you believe that you have high scores, then that's great because you already think that you're adapting and adjusting your thinking and behavior as needed. If you're in moderate, well, you might be starting to recognize some of the cultural norms and beginning to accommodate them. And if you're in low CQ, that's where you're more in reactive mode, where you're experiencing behaviors, communication, perhaps it's unexpected, or perhaps you're even thinking like they're being rude or unprofessional. And that's where you then get into that reactive cycle, which is not obviously a great place to be. But wherever you are with your CQ, there's always room for improvement. And I have very rarely come across somebody who's got high CQ across all the capabilities. Even if you were there, then actually it's a really great place to teach and share with others. So I've already mentioned about CQ Drive, about your interest and curiosity, and that comes from your internal curiosity, but also perhaps there are external benefits from interacting and having that CQ intelligence, cultural intelligence. Those external benefits might be about your career, about growing, if it's your own business, actual sales coming in. And this idea of persistence and confidence, this is the one where I know people often find this quite tricky. It's the idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, not always knowing the right reaction, the right way to interact, and actually then observing in the moment what's going on to be more successful. Knowledge at its simplest level is understanding what is similar and what is different. And I often say to people that when it comes to knowledge, what we're really doing is thinking about ourselves as a social anthropologist, that we are trying to observe the people that we're working with by interacting with them, understanding what's going on. How do they prefer to communicate? How are they saying yes and no? Are they being direct or indirect with us? This can be a really great way to learn, as much as reading all about different cultures or listening to different audiobooks or watching YouTube videos. And here is a really interesting example where CQ knowledge actually went wrong. And this is an example from Toyota, who launched, so this is a Japanese company launching a particular brand of their car, Prado, into the Chinese market. Now, this is an actual advert, a print advert that they ran, which shows the car in the city on a bridge with some dragons. Now, if you're not so familiar with Japanese or Chinese culture, you might say, well, what's wrong with this? Is this a car being advertised? Well, there are a couple of issues which really demonstrate where CQ knowledge was lacking. There are dragons in this particular advert, and the dragons seem to be bowing down to the car and saluting the car. Now, these are statues of dragons I don't know if you can see those in the background. Now, dragons are a very special symbol in China, and the fact that they are being at a lower status to the car is actually seen as a bit disrespectful. That wouldn't normally happen and wouldn't be the way that Chinese people would think about the interaction. The other big problem with this advert is that there is a bridge near Beijing, which has dragons on it, which is called the Marco Polo Bridge. And that bridge is the site where the Japanese invasion started of China, which is clearly culturally insensitive. And as a result, they ran this advert, but they actually had to pull the campaign, which, as you can think, is a very costly mistake. It cost them, they lost a lot of money, they had to rethink the marketing campaign, and it damaged the reputation, and they lost a lot of goodwill for Toyota itself. So as you can see, CQ is not a soft skill or a soft benefit. It can actually, when we get it wrong, the risk is actually quite huge. And here's something else, when we think about, I mentioned direct and indirect communication styles. Let's imagine that you are operating your own business and you need to postpone an important customer meeting tomorrow for an urgent personal or family matter. It happens, right? Something comes up, we can't avoid it, we need to postpone. How would you communicate this? Now, of course, the answer is depends. It depends on who we're talking to and their own cultural context. Just have a little reflect now. Is your own natural communication style more direct, or is it more indirect? I'd love you to write that in the chat now. I'd love to know, how do people consider their own communication style? Direct or indirect? Feel free to write it into the chat now. I'd love to see what people say. Celine says both. Thank you. A bit more direct. Direct. Yeah, so go see, I've got quite a few directs coming through. Fantastic. So I can see that there are some questions, right? So in relation to whom? Who are we talking about? I can see that there are some questions as well about, knowing, being aware of your own natural style, but then also thinking about actually how people have adapted over time. And some people saying both. Thank you so much for adding your comments there. Thank you, Linar, as well. So as you can see, this is not a simple question. Some of this is about context, who we're interacting with. We may have our own personal preferences, and then we may need to think about how we adapt when we're working with different people with different communication styles. And part of what can help us here are cultural values. Now, I use these particular cultural values. Again, there are many different maps and frameworks out there. This one, which is used by the Cultural Intelligence Center as well, is from the research from Ronan and Schenker. And there are 10 different cultural value dimensions. And you can see some of those on screen now. For example, power distance, about how people relate to hierarchy and formality, time orientation, expressiveness. We talked about EQ earlier. Expressiveness is about how we express our emotions, whether culture is more non-expressive or tends to be more expressive or effective. Cultural values, I'm not going to go through all the detail of these here today, but we can again assess these, we can understand people's individual personal preferences, and we can also understand where do generally global clusters tend to be. And this can be really helpful with our cultural knowledge, CQ knowledge, and building this up. Now, from knowledge, we need to apply, we need to go to CQ strategy. And this is about our awareness and ability to plan for multicultural interactions. It is what it says it is. It's planning and, of course, capturing learnings afterwards. But also part of this is the awareness piece. So when you're in the moment, in the meeting, being part of the meeting, but also then understanding what just shifted in the conversation, what is being said and what is not being said, how is it being said? And is there any disconnect between what the verbal communication and the body language, which might give you a message? Now, to demonstrate what I mean by CQ strategy in a little bit more detail, I am going to flash up on screen in a second an image. And I would love for you to write down in the chat first thing that you think of when you see this image. Footballer. Thank you, Pep. Bad parking, irrespectful of rules, idiot. Thank you. Absolutely. Yep. Parking ticket due. Okay, good. Unfair. Thank you, Ryan. What gender is this person? Again, feel free to just write in the chat. My neighbor, Andrea says. Fantastic. Title parking idiot, love that. Female, male, man, male, male. Interesting. Very, very interesting. Okay, so thank you for doing that exercise. Now, our brain is wired to do shortcuts. Of course it is. That is exactly how we operate and interact in life. We see things, we observe things, we then make a judgment, an assumption about what's going on. What might be alternative explanations? So we've all jumped to our assumptions of what's going on here, who's been parking the car and what they and why they did it. Would somebody like to unmute and perhaps like share what could be an alternative explanation for what's going on here?
Emergency.
Emergency.
Yeah, emergency.
Emergency. Fantastic. Thank you. I hear
No one else is-
emergencies.
No one else is parked there.
So nobody else was parked there. Great. Thank you.
They're protecting the car, so the cars next to it won't scrape it if they open the door.
Okay. So maybe this is somebody who really cares about their car. Yeah. Great.
To
They're in the
Maybe a
car park.
handicap. Sorry. Maybe a handicapped person who needs space to get out of the driver's seat.
Fantastic. Thank you. So Sergio, sorry, we were slightly breaking up. I heard Andrea there talking about maybe somebody who's disabled, maybe or handicapped, they can't get out, they need that space. Interesting, very interesting. Any other explanations?
If they own the car park, then they can just park it however they like. They have 10 spaces and they're just totally casual all the time.
That they own the car park. Fantastic. Thank you so much. There are all sorts of potential. Yeah, go on, Salam. Okay. The last one.
Yeah. Or they're not paying attention to their situation, and they're carried away by some thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It sounds lovely and beautiful with the bird song where you are. Yeah, they're away with their thoughts. Maybe something terrible had happened and they're distracted and they couldn't really think about the parking right then. Maybe one of the most brilliant creative explanations I've ever heard was it was snowing when they arrived in the car park and they couldn't see the lines, and then the snow melted and they're in the wrong space. But you know what? This is the point. We have no idea what was going on, what happened, what was really happening for this person and why they parked like this. We jumped to a conclusion, we made an assumption, and we then labeled this person all sorts of things because we put judgments on it. The whole point about CQ strategy is to help us go, okay, what else could really be going on here? And this is so important because this happens a lot. And I'm sure this has happened to you as well, that we are in business situations where somebody does something which we just go, what? Why did they do that? Why did they say that? Why did they write that to me? That's so rude. That's so difficult. Why are they being so difficult? And of course, these are labels. We jump to our shortcuts because we're putting our own values on somebody else. In reality, I would say 99% of the time, people generally want to be professional, right? But there's something we're not seeing. And this is where our CQ strategy helps us to take that step back and work out, okay, what might really be going on here? And then finally, CQ action. This is where we actually have to do something. We have to do something with our verbal communication, our body language, and adjust ourselves to see how we connect. And what's really important here as well is knowing when to adapt and when not to adapt. There are situations where actually adapting would be out of line with integrity, with who we are, or perhaps would be against our own values. And that clearly would not be an ideal place to be. So we have to know when it is appropriate and how we can do that. What levers can we pull in our own behaviours and communication style to be more effective? So that is the framework of CQ. And clearly there is a lot in this. I really just want to give you a sort of bit of a flavour here today, and for you to kind of experience it and see how much fun it can be as well to explore this. It's really difficult for me to put together 8 top tips just in this very short kind of webinar. But a few things to help you think about this going forward. Clearly, both boosting our CQ knowledge is really helpful. So if we can observe people, read, listen, watch, scroll social media, and build up our knowledge base and on different perspectives, then that can be really helpful to us. And at the same time, we need to challenge our assumptions. We cannot be too generous and say, every American is like this, every South African is like this, and so on. And part of that is seeing the person we're with or the people we're with in the moment. What are they like? What's going on? How are they interacting with us? We can, of course, prepare plans, and it can be helpful to think about, well, if they do this, then I will adjust myself in this way. We cannot plan for every single scenario. So we have to get comfortable with this idea of being uncomfortable and not always knowing what will be the right thing to do. And so we have to therefore be very aware of ourselves and adjust as we go. And even simple things, how we make tea, how we order tea, how we say things like yes and no, can really, really make the difference. So these are things which are worthwhile paying attention to. As we come to the end of today's session, I want to talk about where you can go with this if you are finding this topic useful and valuable to you. And I want to share with you a workshop that I'm launching, which is coming up in April, which is all about developing your CQ. Now, today has really been a very short introduction to the topic. And so what I'm going to be doing is launching a live virtual training where you'll get the chance to take the CQ assessment and get your own personal capability scores for each of those 4 capabilities broken down by sub-dimensions. You'll understand your own individual working preferences with cultural values. And that will allow you to then explore the similarities and differences with your people and teams, whoever they might be, whether that is an internal team or with your customers or partners. We'll get into a lot more detail around this idea of CQ strategies for your business context. And it will also help improve your confidence in knowing how and when to adapt your communication style and behavior. And then finally, it's also going to include creating your personal CQ development plan so that you can take it forward and make sure that you're putting into action all the learnings and the insights. Now, that training will include all of this. So I'm going to be running a 2-hour live virtual training session. And you'll have the opportunity to take the assessment, as I mentioned, and you can see some examples of what you'll receive back. So it's really quite comprehensive. There is a 22-page CQ report that includes your CQ profile, your cultural values profile, and helps you understand your scores in relation to worldwide norms. You'll also have access to the e-learning module, which you can do before or after the training. We'll be using a case study to activate your learning application actually inside the training. And you will also have the CQ workbook, which is a fantastic resource you can use afterwards, but we'll also be able to capture all your learnings and insights as you go. Now, that QR code on the screen right now is something that you can use to open up the website and have a look at the training in detail. So feel free to point your device at the screen now, and that will open it up. And just to let you know, it's happening on Tuesday, the 18th of April at this time. So somebody mentioned this is a good time, which is always brilliant to hear. That is 4 p.m. time in London. That allows for everybody to join from the US, but also if you're joining from Israel, as I know there's somebody here from Israel today, at least one, and hopefully some people who are also further east as well. The standard ticket for this is going to be £500. I'm going to be offering a very special price for Global Chamber members, which is £350. And to access that, all you need to do is put Global Chamber as the code at checkout. And I also wanted to extend, for those of you who are not members, a special offer, particularly in the next week. So it's only going to be live for the next 7 days, which is also being able to access that special price, £350, if you choose the early bird offer. So that is what I'm offering here today. I hope today has been a really interesting introduction to this topic. And clearly, I would absolutely love for you to join me on this particular training workshop. If you feel like you have started to get excited about this topic and want to get your personal feedback and further training in this area. It's at this point that I'm going to pause and invite questions. And that can be questions clearly about any aspects of CQ or anything we've discussed here today or the training itself. So please feel free to unmute and let me know if you have any questions at this point.
Victoria, thank you so much. I thought that was really insightful, and I'm looking forward to participating in the workshop because, you know, leading this global business community for several years now, I feel like I've learned a lot. However, there's so many dynamics that I'm introduced to every day, and I think I need to take it to that next level, because a lot of the time when I'm bringing on a new member who is coming into this community for the first time, a big part of the onboarding call is preparing them for the different cultural nuances that they're going to experience in the community. So is there maybe top 2 things that I could say? Could I just ask everybody to go on mute, please? Just until it's your turn to ask a question. We've got plenty of time. What's one of the main things? What's a big question I can ask to uncover what their cultural value is?
Oh, that's a really great question. I suppose it depends on their own experiences. So understanding what cultures they work with and asking them, what have they noticed in similarities and differences with the cultures that they're working with? Have they ever thought about how they adapt their own communication and behaviors to be more successful? It depends on how aware that person is. They may have noticed there are differences or similarities. Assume there is one global way of doing business. Perhaps that is the question that I can start getting them thinking, maybe there are some different ways to approach this.
Thanks, Victoria.
No problems. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see everybody again, actually. So I'm going to come back. So tell me, are there any other questions or even any kind of comments or stories or experiences anybody wants to share here?
Yes, Victoria, I have a question. In the olden days, we all used to travel more to the markets to work with our colleagues, and there was always time for sociability, getting to know them and having chats outside work. In the hybrid world, a lot of that has gone by the wayside. And also the technology kind of affects the way we interact because we don't have, you know, that time to get to know our colleagues as well. Are there any tips you can give in terms of dealing with the tech in order to establish our strategies?
That's a great observation, Fabrinia. And I think for me, it's the idea that we used to obviously see each other face to face. That just helps so much with interpreting things like nonverbal communication, body language, even the fact that clearly in some cultures, it's so important to go for dinner, to share food together, to get to know each other, to know about each other's personal contexts and our families. And you just don't get that, as you say, on a call. People just hop on a call. How are you? Yeah, great. Yeah, great. Okay, let's get going. I think you have to be quite intentional about this. And that's about actually either allowing time in meeting agendas to have that level of small talk without forcing it, or allowing those separate get-togethers, which are intentionally about more social get-to-knows. The other thing that I think massively helps here is really thinking about something like a team communication charter. So particularly teams which are new in working together, or teams that are experiencing perhaps some challenges in how they're interacting and having miscommunications and frustrations. It can just almost be helpful to sit down and start again and go, okay, how do we want to interact with each other? What's important to you? What's important to me? How do we build that in? How do we actually have conversations? I think technology is massively enabling, but we can also get into huge amounts of communication overwhelm, where there's too much communication going on way too many channels. I'm sure we've all experienced that, right? So actually it can be very helpful to say, this is precisely how we want to talk to each other.
That's superb. Thank you very much.
Can I share?
Welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Yes,
can
you can.
I share?
Yeah, please.
I can share, and I can give you a good example. I'm a deputy head of finance, and I'm overseeing 8 different countries in Europe. and we all work remotely because I'm based in London and the controllers are based in their own country. So basically we have informal sessions twice a week. We call them coffee chats, where we meet and we talk about random subjects. And if we find interest, we also started a Spanish-speaking coffee chat for the one who love speaking Spanish and who would like to improve their language. And it's really, and we talk about anything, food, the different bank holidays, to understand that we can understand in each country. So I think we can do stuff, we can do things remotely because we have no choice but doing this remotely.
I love that idea. Thank you so much for sharing. I think it was Celine, wasn't it? So thank you so much. Yeah, it's really fascinating. There are definitely ways of doing it, but I think this is the point. We have to be quite intentional. We have to make the decision we want to do it. So thank you. I'm conscious we're coming towards 4 o'clock, so perhaps this is a good time to pause, but I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone. I loved the interaction, loved your questions, loved your comments, and thank you so much for participating. And I'll hand back to Katie.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and a virtual round of applause for Victoria. What an insightful workshop. And I think you really got me thinking about some of the things that I'm doing. And yeah, a big round of applause. And
Oh,
look,
thank you.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to engage with you in your workshop. I know it's easy enough for a multinational corporate to book you in and do a whole day and work with the team. But if you're a solopreneur or have a small business or have a couple of people in your team that have international exposure, this is a fantastic opportunity to send them to Victoria's workshop. Or if you might have had a bad dealing with someone last week on a call and you think they could really do with some help, that's a great opportunity to refer them as well. It's a way for us to bring our community together, do better business, be better global. And I think that thank you very much for allowing us to have that opportunity. For those who have joined us from around the world, at the Global Chamber, we're here to help open doors for you, give you resources to grow in your business and be more successful. I have put my email in the chat. You can save the chat today. And if you'd like to take the opportunity to pop your details in there and connect with one another as well, that could be ideal to, form some alliances off the back of today's call. I'd love to have a call with you to see how we can help you in your business. Please reach out to Victoria, connect with her on LinkedIn, follow her podcast. We share that every Wednesday. It's fantastic. I love listening to it, and get more involved. Doug, it's great to see you on the call today as well. Our CEO and founder. We only exist because of Doug. Did you want to say goodbye, Doug?
I never want to say goodbye.
I know.
Great conversation today. Looking forward to the session, Victoria. You're amazing.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind, and really appreciate the opportunity to share today. So thank you everyone for joining.
Always a pleasure. And on that note, we'll say goodbye and have a lovely day, morning or evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.